Okay, welcome to our quick review of the 4 traditions of geography. We're going to go through these pretty quickly because they're not a huge part of the test. They're just nice to know in terms of background and kind of the knowledge of the history of geography. So those 4 traditions are that there's kind of an earth science tradition, a man-land tradition, spatial tradition, and then area studies tradition, are what we call them. And essentially what this was came about as a way to make people recognize geography as being really an independent course of study, and independent from and differentiated from many of the things to which it's related, such as history or anthropology or political science and the like. So our first tradition, and really kind of the oldest tradition, is the earth science tradition. And we see this dating really all the way back to even as far as ancient Greece, and maybe even further back. And there's a focus on mapping the world, and to that end, exploring the world and identifying major landmarks, mountains, rivers, streams, new and different peoples, and things like that. And this is where we get our basic original definition of geography as being really about where things are at in space. And again, that spatial perspective, where things are at in space, is what differentiates geography, and it's what makes geography what it is. Okay? So it's not so much about what we're studying that makes geography unique as how we're studying it. Okay? Next, we get what we call a man-land tradition. And this is where we start to see the rise of those geographic questions. Okay? And geographic questions are always focusing on why there. Okay? The why of where. Where is something happening and why there and not somewhere else? And this is around the time we also start to see, and this is a little bit more modern of an approach, the environmental determinist perspective starts to come into play. And that one, if you're not sure, basically environmental determinism says that it's the environment that determines how cultures and how peoples develop. So people who live in colder places are going to work harder, and they're going to advance more quickly because they work harder than people who live in warmer, more tropical places. And that's going to happen because they have to. They have to create, they have to innovate in order to be able to survive. Right? You don't really have to do much, this theory says, if you can go pick coconuts up off the ground or bananas off the tree to eat, and you can do that year-round, versus if you have to save your food or develop a shelter that's going to withstand a blizzard and the like. Okay? The next tradition is our spatial tradition. And the spatial tradition is where we start to see some of that modeling between physical and human geography. And we start to see the overlay of those and the overlay of ideas really in a lot of ways from other sciences, including geology, where you start to see plate tectonics and how does plate tectonics play into what we're seeing and where we're seeing it. For instance, the ring of fire around the Pacific Ocean, right? Why is the ring of fire there? Well, the answer lies in plate tectonics. That's where the plates meet, they push up the mountains, there's kind of that hole in between the two layers of crust, and it enables the lava or the magma to escape and come out to the surface of the earth. Okay. After that, we kind of move on to a more area studies tradition. This is where we're at today. Okay. And an area studies tradition what we focus on more is the relationships that we see between social and physical phenomena. So how did people in Seattle adapt to the rain versus the different adaptations that people in Spokane make, where they're much drier and they get much colder winters, for example. And there's a real focus on the similarities and differences between places as a way in part to get to that why question. Okay. Why do big cities develop where they do? What's similar between New York City, right, and Los Angeles? Or what's similar between even New York and Seattle? What's different? And how that plays into the different ways in which they develop. And we start to focus on everything in the landscape both human and physical, and the ways in which they're interrelated, right? And this is where we then start to get into what's called possibilism or cultural possibilism. And possibilism is essentially the theory that while the environment might provide some constraints, might provide some limits on the ways in which you develop, what it does not do is determine how you develop. Okay, so let me give you an example. If you live in Western Washington, there are certain limits on what you can do, right? There are tons of trees to make homes out of. There's a ton of salmon, right? Or at least there used to be. And so cultures here developed using those tools that the environment provided, right? So salmon, for instance, very, very important culturally, and in terms of food sources and things like that to Native Americans here in the Northwest. But it's important because that's what the environment provided. And if the environment hadn't provided salmon, right, if the environment had provided buffalo, then buffalo would be what's important. But what you'll notice is that there's fundamental similarities, right? Everybody has to meet certain needs, food, shelter, and the like, water, and the like. Once you meet those, that's where human innovation really starts to come into play. And so the ways in which we use those resources, that's what determines how our cultures develop. And when you look at even so-called backwards cultures or undeveloped cultures, what you'll really see is some really incredible innovations and incredible ways of using the environment. Ways that would never occur to those of us who live in the developed world, who we don't really need to adapt to our environment, right? For the most part, a lot of that's been done for us and a lot of that's provided to us. But if you've got an environment where it's a little bit harder to survive, where there's fewer things available, you're going to adapt, but you're going to adapt differently. And you might develop more slowly, but you're still developing. You're still making forward progress. And that's what possibilism is. So that the environment might place some limits on the ways in which you develop, but it does not, at the end of the day, determine how a culture or group of people develops. The people in the culture do that, and they innovate and they create, and that's what drives development. So those are our 4 traditions for geography. Again, it's a quick review. It's not something you're going to find very often on the test, but it is kind of nice to know in terms of some of that background and some of the perspectives and some of the different things that we read. If you have questions, feel free to come and see me, and I'd be delighted to answer any that I can. Thank you very much.